Once a storyline in WWE starts, it usually ends a few weeks or months later. In some cases, a storyline may go on for about a year. However, in some rare moments, WWE storylines aren't resolved until years after they started. In one case, a storyline started in WWE but was finished in AEW. In 2008, CM Punk cashed in his Money in the Bank contract to win the World Heavyweight Championship. Unfortunately, his title reign was rather lackluster. This point was made especially clear with the way he lost the championship. At Unforgiven 2008, CM Punk was supposed to defend the world title in a championship scramble match. However, he was attacked by Randy Orton and the Legacy backstage and could not compete. Chris Jericho ended up winning the match and became the new World Heavyweight Champion. While CM Punk did get a championship rematch, he never got even with the Viper. That was until over 2 years later at the 2011 Royal Rumble. Randy Orton was in a WWE Championship match against The Miz. The Apex Predator was about to win the title, but thanks to a sneak attack by CM Punk, The Miz was able to retain. The next night on Raw, Punk revealed that he did this to get revenge for what Orton had done to him back in 2008. This finally added some closure to the storyline that CM Punk and Randy Orton had started over 2 years ago. Unfortunately for Punk, he was defeated by Orton at both WrestleMania and Extreme Rules. In a heartbreaking moment, Edge was forced to retire from WWE in 2011. While he couldn't compete in the ring anymore, the Radar superstar still made appearances from time to time. During one appearance on Raw in December 2014, Edge and Christian hosted an in-ring segment with Seth Rollins. Rollins used the opportunity to hold Edge hostage and threatened to break the WWE Hall of Famer's neck unless John Cena used his power to bring back Triple H and Stephanie McMahon. Of course, Edge couldn't do anything to Seth since he was retired, and things stayed that way for about 5 years. Then, in 2020, Edge made a surprise in-ring return at the Royal Rumble. A year later, he was competing in a match against Roman Reigns for the Universal Championship. However, Seth Rollins interfered and cost Edge the match. A few days later on SmackDown, Edge addressed Seth and said this.
This goes back to 2014 when we first met. You didn't pull the trigger then to get the job done because you never thought I'd be back here.
This eventually led to a match between Edge and Seth Rollins at SummerSlam, over 6 years after Rollins threatened to break Edge's neck. During the match, Seth tried to pull the trigger and finally hit the Radar superstar with a curb stomp, but Edge didn't allow it and ultimately forced Rollins to tap out. The Attitude Era had a ton of wild storylines. One of the most memorable ones was when Mae Young and Mark Henry hooked up. This resulted in Young giving birth, but her baby turned out to be a hand, just a hand. This was an incredibly bizarre moment, but it was never brought up again after it happened. That was until 12 years later when this randomly happened on Raw.
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Mae Young's son, all grown up.
Without question, one of the most infamous moments in WWE history is the Montreal Screwjob. At the 1987 Survivor Series, Bret Hart defended the WWE Championship against Shawn Michaels. While Michaels had Bret in the sharpshooter, Vince McMahon had the bell run, despite Hart never submitting. Now this was real. McMahon went off the script, and Bret Hart left WWE that night and was never seen in the company again. That was until 2010, when the excellence of execution returned to WWE over a decade after the Montreal Screwjob. Bret and McMahon had a heartwarming moment in the ring and made up. However, it was all a trick, and McMahon low-blowed the Hitman. This led to Mr. McMahon and Bret Hart going one-on-one 12 years after this real-life rivalry between them started. In the end, thanks to help from the Hart family, Bret won and got payback for what Vince McMahon did in Montreal. A couple of months after the WrestleMania match, Bret Hart was made the general manager of Raw. However, Vince McMahon eventually fired Bret and introduced a new Raw GM. Kind of. This person chose to be anonymous and would only communicate through emails on a laptop that Michael Cole would then read. Fans and wrestlers would speculate who the anonymous Raw general manager was, but little hints were dropped, like the emails including references to Stone Cold Steve Austin and Roddy Piper, among many others. The anonymous general manager stayed in power for an entire year, but it was never revealed who it was. The character would disappear abruptly once Triple H and John Laurinaitis became the new on-screen authorities. However, about a year later, we would finally get an answer. In a lead up to the 1000th episode of Raw, various general managers from the past would take control of the show for one night. The anonymous Raw GM was one of them and returned on the July 9th, 2012 episode of Raw, over 2 years after the character was introduced. During the show, Santino Marella made it his quest to discover the anonymous Raw general manager's true identity. Marella found his answer under the ring. No, it wasn't the Boogeyman or the Undertaker, it was Hornswoggle. There wasn't much of an explanation given why the Leprechaun was the one running the show, but we finally figured out who the anonymous Raw general manager was. Now this story storyline is interesting because it started in WWE but ended in AEW. While he was part of the WWE roster in 2018, Matt Hardy hosted the House Hardy Halloween event on the WWE Network. Just as it sounds, the Woken Matt Hardy held a Halloween party at his compound. He invited a lot of guests, like the Boogeyman and the Godfather. The Hurricane was invited too, but before he arrived, he was mysteriously kidnapped by someone. The kidnapper went even further and possessed Hurricane and used him to spike the punch at the party. Matt Hardy eventually figured out what was going on, and with some help from Papa Shango, they were able to make Hurricane disappear. However, before the event was over, we saw that the real Hurricane was still imprisoned by a mysterious hooded figure who vowed that his battle with Matt Hardy wasn't over. Despite this promise, nothing happened. That was until Matt Hardy joined AEW. At the Full Gear pay-per-view in 2020, Matt took on Sammy Guevara at the Hardy compound. Hardy was about to deliver a fatal blow, but was stopped when the dark figure from 2 years earlier appeared with the Hurricane handcuffed. The man revealed himself to be Gangrel, the same person who had mentored Matt Hardy when Matt joined WWE in the 90s. With some help from Private Party, Matt Hardy was able to free the Hurricane, leading to this.
Matt, it's been 2 years. What took so long?
I'm sorry, it's long-term storytelling.
Matt and Hurricane took care of business and defeated Sammy and Gangrel. This closed out a storyline that began in WWE but ended in AEW 2 years later. WWE usually doesn't acknowledge their competitors, but they have taken a few shots at AEW on TV. To see those, watch this video.